Are you with Theresa May on this, that modern slavery victims will become collateral damage of this policy?
Yes, I am, and I think she made some very good points. I mean, let's be very clear. I mean, Theresa May was a very tough Home Secretary for 5 years. I actually disagreed with her strongly on some of her anti-immigration measures, particularly things like trying to keep out overseas students. But the point she was making yesterday, that the legislation is likely not to be effective, as well as causing, quite serious human rights problems. I mean, her points were very well made, and she speaks from experience.
She also, of course, Sir Vince, as you well know, was the Home Secretary that created the hostile environment for migrants, which she continues to get a lot of flack for.
She didn't create it. I mean, it was there. She probably aggravated it.
Yeah.
But as long as I was an MP, 20 years, it was becoming increasingly difficult, starting with, David Blunkett in that era, having more and more constituency cases of people who were running into problems with the Home Office. So the so-called hostile environment's been there for a long time, and the Windrush problem was indeed very much on her watch. But, there is a much bigger issue here that's gone on for a longer period of time.
So the Stop the Boats policy will be popular in the country, Sir Vince. Do you think it can work practically?
I'm not sure it would necessarily be popular. There is a segment of the electorate that is very concerned about immigration in particular, and the so-called small boats problem in particular. There's no evidence that the public at large are deeply alarmed about the problem, and the evidence seems to suggest that anti-immigrant sentiment is strongest in areas where the population of immigrants is lowest. There is a very particular problem about asylum, as we now know. There have been repeated attempts to deal with it, and none of them have been effective, and I don't think this will be effective. I mean, there are things we have to do. We have to have a good collaborative relationship with the French over returns, over the issue of policing to stop smuggling. We need some safe routes for countries where there is clearly a chronic human rights issue. Afghanistan as opposed to Albania, they're very different cases. A lot needs to be done. It's a very difficult problem, and Britain isn't the only problem struggling with this. A lot of people are dying crossing the Mediterranean. It isn't just a British problem.
What would the Liberal Democrats do, Vince? What will the policy be running up to the election for the Lib Dems?
Our policy is to acknowledge that, of course, you have to have secure borders. Everybody accepts that. But that we do need a humane and reasonable approach to people seeking asylum. We've done so for creating safe routes for people from the Ukraine, absolutely rightly, also from Hong Kong, and for a very limited number of Afghans. And where people are fleeing countries where there is a genuine risk of persecution, I mean, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, we need to have a legal route so that people from those countries are not forced into these illegal channel crossings. But where you have illegal immigration for economic reasons, say people coming from Albania, then of course we must stop and deport people who are coming illegally, and that has to be firm and very clear.
Last year, Sir Vince, 45,000 people came to Britain across the Channel. Suggestions it will be far higher this year. Those numbers are surely unsustainable with the impact on social cohesion, housing, hospitals, schools.
Well, the figure of 45,000 has to be put in the context of net immigration of about 300,000. And if you're worried about the impact on social services, that's the calculation that we have to make. Personally, I think net immigration has been generally beneficial from the UK, but there are pressure points. You're quite right, and we have to safeguard those. But the 45,000 asylum seekers is little over 10% of total net immigration. It's a difficult problem, but it's not a massive problem in terms of numbers.
What do you make of the language the Home Secretary uses, Sir Vince? Is it inflammatory?
It is somewhat, yeah. I think likening it to Nazi Germany almost certainly isn't a good analogy, but it is inflammatory. And those of us who've been around a long time will remember that there's a long tradition of this. Enoch Powell and his rivers of blood, and there have been episodes of this ever since, which is why I, disagree probably with you about Gary Lineker. I think he may not have chosen his words very well, but it was perfectly reasonable to use his Twitter feed to make some comment about it.
Now, you're in the lovely town of Twickenham there on the river. Rishi Sunak is fortunate to live also by the river in Yorkshire, but apparently he needs somewhere else to swim, Vince, and his swimming pool has required an upgrading of the local electricity supply so that he can keep it warm enough. What is your take on that when people can't at the moment afford to pay their own electricity bills?
Well, I think people in high political position have to set an example. I mean, when I was a cabinet minister, we had our pay frozen. We travelled in a second class wherever possible. We're trying to set an example in difficult conditions, and leadership has got to come from the top. It's not a good example.
Sir Vince, he should follow the example of Mrs Thatcher, who refused to heat the swimming pool at Chequers because she said that it wasn't fair on the public purse.
Those days are gone.
Well, yeah, I mean, Mrs Thatcher had her strong points, and one of them was that she put austerity into practice in her own life, as far as we can judge. So, yeah, I think that's a good role model.